Good afternoon. Welcome to our chapel series and the start of Wednesday Night Live. We've got a really special guest that we're going to let him get into his topic. Is Dr. Lloyd Melton. He retired 2 years ago as a professor and on the faculty at the Erskine Seminary, just down the road. And he was on the faculty there 42 years. Wow. That's, and so you saw a lot of faces come and go, and he's still got some things to teach us. Gene Mahaffey, heard him at the South Carolina Lay School of Theology, which the Presbyterian Church sponsors. Our Presbyterians in South Carolina sponsor this. It's called the Lay School. And you mentioned offhand, according to her, Dr. Melton, the intertestamental period, this 400 years that we don't know, give or take, that we don't know much about. And so Gene Mahaffey gets a little credit for snagging you on that. And thank you for agreeing.
I have to be careful what I say.
Yeah, but she heard that. She did hear that. So we're going to let you get started, and anything else you need to add, but welcome, thank you, and folks, get your questions ready because there might be a few.
It is really good to be with you for this time that we have together. What I have, and really all I'm going to say about myself is that I retired officially almost 2 years ago, but I'm still teaching for them. And I'm also teaching for Presbyterian College, which is the first place that I ever learned about the intertestamental period. I was a religion major there and finished in 1971. And one of the courses that I had, as a matter of fact, one of the first electives that I had under Professor George Ramsey. He had just come during my sophomore year, and he unfortunately passed 2 years ago. Some of you may know him, but one of his courses was Between the Testaments. Actually, that's where I bought this book by D.S. Russell that we'll talk about in a minute. That was one of our textbooks. So that was my first time to be introduced to that. I didn't know that an intertestamental period existed. So I'm glad to be with you. What I plan to do is to go no further than 45 minutes, and then that gives us time for questions. Now let me, at the outset, tell you, I'm not a specialist in intertestamental studies. There are many of those in the world. It's not only been neglected, by most churches and Christians, but scholars do as well. In preparing for this, one of the things that I was really surprised about is how little secondary literature there is on it. People just don't know what to do with it, or maybe they really do believe it was a dead and solid time. It really was anything other than that, as we'll see. But we'll work for a while, and then questions that you have. I've never been reluctant to say I don't know. It's no problem to me whatsoever, because you can literally fill books with things that I don't know. That's what books are filled with. Any problem with that whatsoever. Now, this one-page outline that we have today, this is going to outline what we will be doing for the next 2 sessions, this week and next week, sessions 1 and 2, and that is, one of the things that people are interested in, obviously, in regard to the intertestamental period, is what happened. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're not going to talk about everything that happened and every person involved. We're going to talk about the major events that happened and why they were important and are important. And so in sessions 1 and 2, we'll be dealing with events and persons and things that happened. We're going to sort of set the table tonight, because you can't understand the intertestamental period unless you understand something of what happened before. So we're going to sort of talk about that and then get into the intertestamental period, and then next week we will talk about some of these significant events that took place there. Now, and then in session 3, we're going to talk about the literature that came out of the intertestamental period. Now, virtually all of that literature is non-canonical. It was never included in anyone's canon of Scripture, but this was a period of tremendous literary output. Some of the literature has not survived. It's referred to in what did survive, but it's not hasn't survived. And so we're going to talk about the different types of literature, and I'm going to try to give you some samples and maybe even printed samples of what types of literature developed during that time, because that may be something you want to pursue. And then, so that's what we'll be doing in session 3. And then in session 4, what we're going to deal with is the so what question. Okay, we spent 3 weeks studying the intertestamental period. You've been introduced to a lot of significant other works that you can look at if you're interested in pursuing your studies in that. What does it mean for us here and now? I think there are some significantly important things that are important to notice in terms of the contribution of the intertestamental period. And I'll just tell you one of them up front, just to sort of whet your appetite. The word Sadducee and Pharisee, which of course dominates the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, they're raring to go as soon as Jesus begins his public ministry. Neither one of those words occurred in the Old Testament. They didn't exist. And yet by the time we get to Jesus' public ministry, they are not only do they exist, but they have formed into a group, and at least with regard to the Sadducees, they are among the most powerful people in the Holy Land. Where'd they come from? Well, we're going to learn where they came from. And because their origin is in the intertestamental period. And that helps us, I think, to understand some of the confrontations they had with Jesus and his responses to them. So in the 4th session, we're going to say, okay, what do we learn from the intertestamental period, and why is it important for us to devote this time and energy to it when we could be studying something else if we wanted to? I think it's worth the effort, and so we're going to talk about, hopefully talk about some concrete things that we learn and concrete contributions that knowing something about that period of time helps us in our daily living here. Okay, now I've listed at the very top, we'll define the intertestamental period in a minute, but I've listed here at the very top some of the resources, and honestly, these are some of the few resources, current resources, that I have found if you were interested in reading further. The one that I've already mentioned to you is this little paperback book called Between the Testaments. It's by a prominent Old Testament scholar named D.S. Russell. Of course, he is long gone. This book was written in 1960, and it was used in Professor Ramsey's course that I was part of back in the late 60s and early 70s at Presbyterian College. My copy is sort of beat up a little bit, and I think I dropped it in the rain at some point. But it was real cheap. I think I paid $1.50 for that. You won't get it for that today. It's more pricey. This is not an exhaustive introduction. It's not terribly well organized. It really deals more with the theology that comes out of, the religious themes that come out of it, and the literature that comes out of the intertestamental period. But this would be, if you're interested in reading further, this would be a good place to start. Now, the book by Charles Pfeiffer, I've never read or never looked at. I've read other works of his. That would probably also be a very readable book. Probably would be a little bit more comprehensive than the D.S. Russell book. And then the first one, which I have not looked at, it's a relatively recent book. You'll notice that most of these books are written in the 60s and 70s. There's not a whole lot of new stuff coming out today, and I think one of the reasons for that is that the 60s and the 70s were also the time where we were beginning to unlock the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were discovered in 1947. And they were beginning to see, scholars were beginning to see the Dead Sea Scrolls and begin to understand their significance. And so probably that was, although they were not connected to, the intertestamental period directly as far as we know, but that's probably why we had some of the works on the intertestamental period published during that period of time, the 60s and 70s, because there were a lot of stuff was coming out like that. Now, I say the last one, the best one for the last. This is a classic. I've only brought one volume by Emil Schur. He wrote this. There are 4 volumes current, a total of 1,800 pages. Detailed footnotes at the bottom, no pictures. This is a hard read for us, but this is the most comprehensive treatment of Jewish history. He actually begins his treatment in the year 175 BC. That's when things really went south in the intertestamental period for the Jews. And he extends it on through the 1st century AD and until the year AD 135, when the Jewish people actually engaged in a second revolt against Rome. And Jerusalem was not just destroyed, it was literally leveled, and a pagan temple was built in place of it. So he goes further than we're going here, a bit further. But Schur wrote this in 1885. It has been significantly revised and updated, and now there are, I think, 4 volumes of it all together. I just brought the first one. But this is the standard work. It would probably take you the biggest part of a lifetime to have any mastery of it whatsoever, because Schur was one of those phenomenal minds that does not come along very often, and had a tremendous grasp of Judaism. But this is the best of all of them, but probably and certainly beyond my ability to invest the time and energy into it. Okay. Yes, sir.
I've got a friend that enjoys rereading War and Peace many times. He probably enjoys that book.
Take that as a compliment or something. Yeah. Okay. Other questions you want to raise before we start putting together some things? All right. The obvious question that you have to start out with is, what is the intertestamental period? And you'll get different answers. Roughly, it is the 400 years before the time of Jesus. It doesn't have an exact beginning point or an exact ending point, but there are 4 centuries where traditionally Jewish people look at the end, and Christians look at the end of the Old Testament with Malachi. Malachi is usually dated as appearing around 400 BC. So the last picture we get of Israel in the Old Testament is in Malachi, and it's not a real pretty one. The people have sort of fallen back into some of their old habits, and so they're still coming to the temple to offer sacrifices to God. But they're bringing their lame animals. They're bringing the sick animals. Remember, the law specified you bring your best. You don't bring, stuff you don't want anyway. And they had a lot of other problems. So that the last picture of God's people in the Old Testament is not really very pretty one at all. Now, it is traditionally Jewish people maintain, and probably many Christians, that was the end of God directly speaking to people, prophets, and others who would give us books. Some Old Testament scholars would argue that some parts of the Old Testament, not some of the Psalms and maybe some other places in the Old Testament, may have been composed during this 400-year period of time. But by and large, the contents of the Old Testament had been settled. They had not been canonized yet. But these 39 books that we have now were books that Jewish people were reading. And though there was no official closing of the Old Testament canon until really after the time of Jesus, so far as we know, we really don't know much about that process. But the 39 books that we have now were beginning to settle in, and they were beginning to be seen as the Old Testament scriptures that God Himself has revealed to the prophets and to others who produced them. And so in Jewish thinking, these years are silent years, as they're often called, because they believed that God had stopped directly speaking to His people. And the reason is His people had refused to listen to it all through the Old Testament. They'd refused to be obedient. The Old Testament story is just it's almost like a yo-yo. Israel is constantly coming back to God and then going away. Constantly coming back to God and then going away. And so for the Jewish people, their belief was that God directly, or He stopped directly speaking to His people through the prophets and through the psalmists and through the other people who were instruments of God, but that God had not abandoned His people. God continued to speak to His people, but He spoke to them through the words that He had already delivered and were written down. But the expectation was that one day, and this was based on an Old Testament prophecy, one day God would pour His Spirit back onto His people. There's a part of the book of Joel that promises that. And so the people of God during this intertestamental period, they were not in despair all the time. They did not believe that God had abandoned them or had stopped speaking to them. He had spoken to them through the works of the law and the works of the prophets, and those were beginning to circulate among them, and that's what they were hearing and heard in the synagogues and so forth. And so it wasn't a direct speech. There was no prophet now who stood before them and says, "Thus says the Lord." But now God was continuing to speak through the words that He had already uttered and that had been written in the Old Testament books. And God's Spirit was with His people in the sense that it enabled them to understand them and to live by them. One day, Joel says, God will pour out His Spirit in a different way. And of course, the Jewish people were satisfied with that. And so these are not 400 years where God had abandoned His people Israel. Some of them may have felt that, but no, He was still with them. But He was not as immediate as He was when He would send prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others who would stand before the people and utter, "Thus says the Lord." His presence, His word was immediate. So we're talking about roughly the 400 years before the time of Jesus. Now, to understand this period of time, we have to back up. And we first have to talk about the most tragic event in the Old Testament. The most shattering event in the Old Testament. It happened in 587 BC. It is actually described in 2 Kings 24 and 25 and in the last chapter of the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah 52. Jeremiah witnessed it. He was an eyewitness of it. And what happened was that Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. Now, in the Old Testament, Israel, of course, began at the time of Saul, David, and Solomon. It was a united kingdom. And so that was really the time, particularly the time of David, where Israel and the borders changed from time to time. But we would call it Palestine, the day of the Holy Land. Israel was a nation to be reckoned with by the other Near Eastern nations. The golden age for the people of God even today was the time of David, about 1000 BC. Israel was it was strong militarily, it was strong spiritually and morally, and it was strong economically. And so that really is about the only time that Israel in the Old Testament was really one of the big boys in the ancient Near East. And it was a time of peace. So their army really wasn't tested very much. There were no major threats over the horizon. But of course, David is followed by Solomon, his son, and Solomon, of course, has this glorious reign, but a funny thing happens when Solomon dies. The kingdom splits into two. You have the northern kingdom, and you have the southern kingdom. Northern kingdom was much bigger, had 10 tribes. The southern kingdom was basically centered around Jerusalem, and it had 2. And now you have 2 independent, separate histories given in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. The northern kingdom was always more rebellious against God. You know, when the split took place and you had the northern kingdom, you know, Jerusalem, or the southern kingdom, which centered in Jerusalem, it got all the marvels. It got the temple. It got the priesthood, it got the government, it got the army, it got everything. And so the northern kingdom, which was much larger, but it had to start from scratch. They had to build a government, they had to build an army, they had to build an economy, they had to build the whole thing. And so it was pretty much on the ropes from the very beginning. And of course, the northern kingdom was much less interested in living their lives in obedience to God. They were surrounded by these, the Baals, the lords, various gods and goddesses, and they were constantly following them instead of God. And so the northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. BC. The Assyrians, of course, who were the absolute worst warriors in the Old Testament, their capital was Nineveh up here. They swept down and they literally destroyed the land, and then they took the people away in captive into exile, and the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, disappeared. Those people never came back. They ceased to exist. Well, now you have the southern kingdom, tiny, but centered in Jerusalem. And now it is there, they're there by themselves. They no longer have the northern kingdom. Of course, those 2 kingdoms didn't like each other much anyway, so it didn't lose much. But anyway, in 587, the southern kingdom falls to Babylon. And the Babylonians, after, they were not choir boys, but they were not as they were not bloodthirsty the way the Assyrians were. They captured people, they exiled people, but they showed them mercy. Babylon did just about everything they could to keep from invading Judah, but finally just gave up. And so they come and they destroy Jerusalem. They take the king away. The government is gone. The temple is desecrated. It's burned. The Babylonian king comes and takes the silver vessels and the sacred metal vessels in the temple, and he takes them back to Babylon and melts them down. And I guess gives them out as souvenirs or whatever. And the southern kingdom is gone, 587. But before he does that, he rounds up the people in Jerusalem that survived, that weren't killed. He rounds them up and he takes them off to Babylon, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Babylonians were very merciful and kind to the people. They gave them lands. They let them alone as long as the exiles there did not disobey Babylonian law. Then they were left alone. And they basically could run their lives the way they wanted to. The only thing they couldn't do, they could not revolt against Babylonian authority. But essentially, the Babylonians, that the whole purpose of exile was not really to punish people. It was to take rebelling people off of their land. Because if you leave them there, they're going to rebel again. So the best thing to do is just take them away. But life in exile was not that bad. And later, when they actually have the opportunity to come back and rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild their homes, most of them choose to stay in Babylon. Babylon wasn't too bad, and after all, it was a second generation now. And nobody was interested. I mean, it's like your children. When you talk about something that happened in 1960, I mean, they think first of all you're dummy, and whatever what happened in 1960. They can't even count in 1960 sometimes. But it was that kind of thing, and so there was a whole new generation now that was of Jewish people, and why would they go back and start from scratch, rebuilding a city that the walls had holes in them, had been broken down, the temple was burned and desecrated, the palace was destroyed or burned and desecrated, and the land, when the Babylonians got done with it, they would go out and see fields of grain, and just for the heck of it, they would set them on fire. Who wants to go back and rebuild that? The only people that the Babylonians left behind were the poorest of the poor. And so even when they have a chance to come back, most of them choose not to, but eventually small groups go back and they eventually succeed in rebuilding. They actually rebuild the temple in 515. The temple is rededicated and they rebuild it, and they then get to work on rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, and they rebuild it in a measure. It just is never the glorious city that it was in the days of Solomon. And the temple that they rebuilt, is nothing compared to the glory and majesty of Solomon's temple. There's a scene in the book of Ezra, where Ezra describes the day that the new temple was dedicated in 515. And he says there were two groups of people. They were in a dedication service like we dedicate, church buildings and so forth. One group was, the younger ones were laughing and joyous and rejoicing at this new temple. And the older ones were weeping, because the older ones remembered how Solomon's temple was. And this new temple was nothing to be compared. The young ones, of course, had never seen Solomon's temple. And so this is the most tragic event, humanly speaking, in the Old Testament. Now, I said all that to say this. From this point on, the Jewish people are a part of somebody else's empire. Their independence and their glory days that they had, those things are just memories. And I'm sure those memories gave them great comfort as they remembered the times of David and Solomon and all the great kings that they had. But right now, they're a part of someone else's world. And they're going to be that way pretty much from here on out. So this is sort of the backdrop. Well, the Babylonian Empire started real good, ended real quickly. Because in 539, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians. The Persians were up here. The Babylonian Empire was basically centered around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and of course it extended into Palestine, because that's where the Jewish people were. But it was an empire that was sort of destined to fail. Now, the story, and this story comes from some of the Babylonian surviving documents. Many people question its truthfulness. And so I'm not going to vouch for it one way or the other, but I think it makes the point. I think it makes the point for why Babylon fell, because the reasons that Babylon fell are apparent in the literature. According to this story, Babylon was this massive, majestic city that was 4 square, and they had a wall around it that was wide enough for 4 horses and chariots to ride side by side, all the way around. The wall was dug into the desert sand, according to this, 80 feet. So the footing was 80 feet. You know, the footing for my house is about 8 inches. 80 feet. It's massive. And of course, they put guard towers all the way around it. And the Euphrates River ran right through it. Right under the walls, right through it. And according to this story, Cyrus, he was the Persian ruler, and the Babylonian rulers were not as cruel and heartless as the Assyrian kings were, but they had their share of cruelty and lack of concern, but they were humane toward those people that they captured. The Persians were even more humane. They were less militaristic than the Babylonians were, less cruel. So, of course, the Babylonian Empire begins to fall because of its own excesses. Here's the story. The story was that Cyrus, who was now the leader of the Persian Empire, or was building the Persian Empire, Cyrus, and of course in those days, warfare was a whole lot more efficient than it is for us. In Old Testament times, when you captured the country's capital, the rest of it went with it. So you didn't have to go and do a bunch of mopping up exercises for pockets of resistance. You went for the capital. That's why in the Old Testament world, you always built your capital on a hill, if you could. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom that fell to the Assyrians in 722, and that Samaria is a mountain. The other name for Jerusalem is Mount Zion. David made Jerusalem his capital because he could put it on a hill, and it's much easier to defend a hill than it is, a city on a hill than it is one that's in a plain somewhere. Okay, Cyrus, they had their spies in that day the way we have ours. So Cyrus knew what was going on in Babylon. He knew that the empire was beginning to deteriorate. He knew that the morale and the morality was deteriorating. He knew that. And so he goes after the city of Babylon. Here's what he does, according to the story. He builds a dam somewhere around downstream at the Euphrates River, and of course before he builds that dam, he has his men carve out this huge hole in the desert. And when they think the hole is deep enough and big enough and so forth, and they build the dam, and he diverts the water into this hole, to this big pond like that. And so the water stops flowing under the city of Babylon. The river gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and finally it's just knee deep. And he orders his men to crawl under the wall. And they do. And what they find is that the city of Babylon is engaged in this long weekend of celebrating, and everybody's drunk. Half of the guard, it sounds like a tailgate. Half of the guard towers don't even have guards in them. The few that are in the guard towers are so intoxicated they can't resist. And Cyrus of Persia takes the city of Babylon without drawing a sword. Mighty, mighty Babylon falls. And the Persians are now in control. Now, they are benevolent toward the people that are in Babylon now that have been exiled, including the Jewish people. The Persians were more benevolent than even the Babylonians did. And so they are kind to those people. They are kind to the Jewish people. They continue to allow them to come back and rebuild Jerusalem, so that by the time we get to the intertestamental period, by the time, well, it's later than 400, but by the time we get to the 300s and so, there are a lot of Jewish people that have returned home to Palestine. There is a semblance of a temple. It's not the majestic temple that King Solomon had, but the temple has been rebuilt. And there is some semblance of a kind of government structure, though they are not independent. They are a part of the Persian Empire, but the Persians were very loose with the people that they captured, that were part of the Persian Empire. They did not require that those people, be totally committed to them and change their habits and so forth. Again, like the Babylonians, the Persians would allow this community of Jews to be there and pretty much leave them alone if they would not rebel, if they didn't break Persian laws. The Persians were allowed, they didn't torture them, they didn't, do inhumane things to them at all. As long as the people were peaceful toward them and would obey whatever Persian laws they had to, they were okay. So it was a pretty peaceful time during this time of the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the fall, not the fall, but the weakening and demise of the Persian Empire. Okay, well, this changes. That's sort of the setting. Around 350 BC, and I guess we can see it better around, but I'm not going to try to do it. But up here in Macedonia would be over here. But in Macedonia, what exists in terms of government structures are independent Persian city-states. A city-state was a structure that sort of is unusual to us, at least anyway, but it's a group of people that live in a place, and in some ways they function like a city, and in some ways they function like a state, but they're independent. Because again, Persia, by this time, Persia is beginning to loosen its grip, it's beginning to decline, and so it's not really rigidly holding on to any of the countries that it's conquered. And so in Macedonia, which would be, up here, in Macedonia, there are a significant number of independent city-states. These are basically groups of people that function both as a city, as a state. In other words, there's some oversight by somebody, but they also are very much individual and have a lot of individual rights and so forth. And so, enter Philip of Macedonia. He was from Macedonia. We know it now. So Philip of Macedon sees all these city-states up there in Macedonia, and he goes to them and he says, I want you to join with me. And of course the city-states, they're independent entities. They're not interested in joining with anybody, and they, of course, reject his proposal, and then he makes it clear. He says, well, here's the deal. You either join with me or we're going to destroy you. Now that clarifies all kinds of options. I mean, in other words, his way, what he began to do is he began to put together under his control these independent Persian city-states. He begins to build. This is the beginning of the Greek Empire, because Philip of Macedon was a Greek, and he sees that you've got all these independent city-states that used to be tightly connected to Persia, but now Persia is declining, and so these places just sitting there by themselves. And they're not ruled by anybody, they rule themselves. So, but Philip comes in and says, I'm going to rule you, and I will have an army that will protect you. And so this is the beginning of the Greek Empire, which would be the next great empire after the Persians. Well, unfortunately, Philip is killed in battle somewhere around 336. And he is followed by his son, Alexander. Alexander the Great. Alexander was one of the most phenomenal and one of the most self-destructive persons who ever lived. He dies at 32. But he was fighting for his father Philip when he was 12 years old. And he was fearless as a warrior. He picks up where his father left off. And he begins to get more of those independent city-states joined together into one unit. He's making the Greek Empire bigger, larger. Once again, his method of convincing people was not diplomacy. It was sheer military force. Alexander was a fearless warrior, and sometimes he would run his soldiers until they literally died. He would ride his horse until the horse died. He would pursue enemies day and night for weeks. Before too long, and of course part of this is because the Persian Empire is dissipating, and it's sort of his for the taking. But Alexander begins to build the Greek Empire, which was one of the world's greatest empires. But like almost always, its seeds of destruction were a part of its greatness. It's amazing how much that is a cycle that repeats itself in human history so much. And so Alexander is a fearless warrior. He had deep-seated personality problems. He was prone to Great Depression. He was never married. He was prone to Great Depression, and of course he tried to solve that depression, by drinking booze. And of course, you know that alcohol is a depressant. It doesn't help you be depressed. It doesn't solve your depression. It makes you more depressed. And he dies, according to the story, he dies at an early age, early 30s, 32 or 33, after a drunken binge that he was going on for 4 days when he was grieving over the death of one of his most trusted soldiers. And so Alexander is dead in 323. He had no children. He has no heirs. Nobody to leave the kingdom to. And of course, by that time, the Greek Empire is over here. I mean, it's controlling the ancient Near East. That's where the trouble starts. And that's where we're going to pick up next week. The splitting of Alexander's empire. He had no heirs, so what does he do? Well, it's divided among his generals. Well, you know what a bunch of generals are going to do with that. You got problems before we get started. And that's where the conflict that we see in the New Testament appears. That's where we see it. It starts now. But it's only the result of all these years, these centuries, that the Jewish people who used to be this great and powerful nation, and they're now a part of somebody else's empire. They still want to be a great nation, but they're nowhere even close to that now. And so that's where we will start. Now, according to my watch, it's 6:15, so are there questions that you want to raise that come up? I know we have a meal afterwards, and we don't want other people to beat us there. But are there questions you want to raise? Yes, ma'am.
When did they stop doing burnt offerings?
I'm sorry?
When did the Jewish people stop doing burnt offerings? Was it AD 70?
Yeah, because obviously when the temple was destroyed in 587, there was a period of time there where there was no place to do burnt offerings. When the temple was rebuilt, and then Herod the Great, of course, he didn't really change the temple. The temple building itself was relatively modest, but he built this huge platform around it. And there were all kinds of other buildings, and the temple complex in Jesus' day is estimated to be 35 acres. The temple itself was not that big of a building, but there were all kinds of buildings that serviced the temple. You know, you have sacrificial animals, you got to have a place to keep it. And so there were all kinds of things. But yeah, that's when it stopped.
Dr. Miller,
Sir. Yes.
during the time of Philip and Alexander the Great, and you said some of these folks had started coming back to the Jerusalem area, what was happening to them? Were they just subsistence, or were they?
We don't really have a clear picture from the sources that we have, because the sources, the primary sources that we have for reconstructing this period are very, very slim, very few. But it appears that there was some semblance of independence that they enjoyed, because nobody was trying to take them. Then they could grow their crops and their economy could grow and so forth. So it really seems like, my best guess would be that life was getting pretty good for them.
They didn't really have anything to give to be
No.
conquered.
No.
So there wasn't
No.
any pork.
That's the good thing about losing a piece of land. Nobody can take it from you again because you don't have it. And that's sort of redneck sense, I guess. It really did help them that they didn't have to defend something that they could no longer defend, I guess. Okay, other questions? Go on, Ray. All right, well, we're going to pick up the story here next week, and we're going to see what happens, and this is where the real conflict among the Jewish people, they get into a war with one another. And this is where it starts. You will see that the more things change, the more they remain the same. The issues, that what happened to them, of course, is what happens to any society, including our own. And so we'll look at that, and then look at some concrete times where this sort of broke out in public. Okay?
Thank you.
All right.